Imagine a silence that deafens. We are standing at an altitude of almost 7 kilometers, on the summit of the Lulailaco volcano, where the air is as sharp as a knife's edge. Here, in the icy sarcophagus of the Andes, time stopped 5 centuries ago, and in the very heart of this silence, she sits, a young girl, frozen on the threshold of eternity. Her perfect skin is untouched by decay. Her eyelashes seem only momentarily frozen. Her hands, folded on her lap, radiate a frightening, inhuman calm. She wears a tunic of vicuña wool, so precious that only the direct descendants of the sun god could wear it. Her jet-black hair is braided into hundreds of the finest plaits with a perfection that defies the centuries. She looks like a sleeping princess from an ancient legend, awaiting her awakening. But do not let this deceptive beauty mislead you. This is not a serene slumber. This is a crime scene, bound in the ice of eternity. Modern science has been able to peer beneath the veil of this perfect preservation and has discovered a soul-chilling truth. Her young lungs did not fail due to illness or old age. They were crushed by slow suffocation in a walled-up stone tomb while her heart was still beating. This was not a simple taking of a life. It was a meticulously planned ritual, executed with the cold precision of a divine bureaucracy and draped in the mantle of the highest honor. She was not the victim of a tragic accident. She had been prepared for this end since her very childhood. She was one of the chosen, a precious cog in the gigantic mechanism of imperial power that ground up human fates for the prosperity of the state and the appeasement of the gods. But before she became a museum exhibit, before she was turned into an icy statue at the summit of the world, she had a name. She had a panicked fear, and she had a story that no one dared to tell. To hear her silent scream, we must descend from these celestial heights and make a leap into the past. To the winter of 1532, to a tiny barred window in the sacred capital of the Incas, the city of Cusco. There, another 14-year-old girl named Quila meets the dawn with terror, because she knows for certain, for her empire, perfect beauty is not a gift, but a death sentence. To understand the essence of the golden cage in which Quila languished, we must first learn who forged its bars. This ruthless machine of control did not arise from nothing. It was born in the brilliant and calculating mind of Pachacuti, the 9th Sapa Inca. It was he who, in 1438, transformed the modest mountain settlement of Cusco into the beating heart of a colossal empire that would subdue the entire Andean range with an iron grip. Pachacuti, whose name meant "he who shakes the earth," understood the fundamental law of absolute power. He realized that to hold dozens of conquered peoples in submission, neither invincible armies nor cyclopean stone fortresses were enough. He needed to possess something more sacred, more intimate. He needed to become the absolute master of their children. Thus was born the system of the Acalahuasi, the houses of the chosen. Modern historians often soften this concept, calling them monasteries or abodes of priestesses, but in reality, it was a perfectly tuned system for collecting human tribute. Every year, with clockwork precision, imperial dignitaries known as the Apu Panaka journeyed to the farthest corners of the conquered lands. Their arrival was not a signal for celebration, but for a quiet, blood-chilling terror that gripped the hearts of mothers. These richly robed men came not for maize, nor for textiles, nor for gold. They came to collect the most precious harvest, girls. The selection process was clinically cold, emotionless, and dehumanizing, more reminiscent of an inspection of elite livestock for the imperial herds. All girls between the ages of 8 and 10 were herded into the central square, and a meticulous inspection began. The selection criteria were biologically ruthless and allowed for no compromises. The officials sought absolute physical perfection. A flawlessly symmetrical face, smooth skin without a single pockmark or even a birthmark, a full set of straight white teeth, and a proud posture that spoke of natural nobility. Kilya remembered that day with the searing clarity of an unhealed trauma. She was only 8 when she, trembling, was placed in a line of girls from her native village under the merciless mountain sun. She could still feel the inspector's rough fingers, crudely turning her face, prying open her jaws to check her teeth, appraisingly running through her thick, black hair. They did not look into her eyes. They looked through her, as if assessing the quality of a material, its suitability for the empire's needs. Out of the 200 girls from her province, the official's pointing finger stopped on Kilya. In that very instant, her childhood was over. Her name and origin were recorded in the knotted script of a quipu, turning her into official state property. From that second on, she no longer belonged to her parents, her community, or even herself. Her body and her future had become a resource of the empire. Her mother, seeing her only daughter being led away, broke into desperate wails that did not cease for 3 days and 3 nights. However, the local elder, the curaka, was forced to intervene. His words were cruel, but they reflected the very essence of Incan policy of total control. He explained to the distraught woman that any attempt to hide the girl or resist the selection would not save Kilya, but would only condemn their entire family to a torturous retribution. The empire did not forgive disobedience when it came to its sacred tax. Such was the unshakable logic of Tawantinsuyu, the 4 united parts. Conquered provinces gave the purest and most beautiful thing they had, their daughters, in exchange for peace and protection from the almighty emperor. It was an unspoken social contract, sealed with innocent children's tears. Thus, Kilya was torn from her home, like a precious but inanimate object, and sent on a long journey along the paved imperial roads toward the distant and frightening Cusco. As she moved away from the mountains that had seen her birth, she did not yet know that she was entering a conveyor belt of ideological indoctrination, from which there were only 3 exits. What her mother did not know, or perhaps what no one in the village dared even whisper, fearing the ubiquitous imperial spies, was that the Akala, the chosen virgins, had only 3 possible fates, and none of them involved returning home. These girls were not raised to become wise rulers or scholars. They were cultivated, like the rarest orchids in a conservatory, only to be cut at the most opportune moment. Some were destined to become bargaining chips in high politics, given as wives to elderly generals or chiefs of wild tribes. Others faced the fate of being buried alive to form the retinue of a deceased nobleman. And the most perfect ones, like Kilya, spent their entire short lives under the Damoclean sword of an obsidian knife on the sacrificial altar. The Akla Huasi was not just a building, it was a hermetic universe, cut off from the world by colossal stone walls that obscured even the peaks of their native mountains. For Kilya and the hundreds of other girls imprisoned here, time flowed differently. It was measured not by the changing of seasons, but by an endless succession of rituals in glory of the sun god Inti. The Spanish chronicler Pedro Chiesa de León, who saw these structures with his own eyes, wrote with astonishment that these women were guarded with such jealousy that, under penalty of immediate execution, they were forbidden not only to leave the gates, but even to speak with a man. The only males allowed inside were eunuchs, silent and impassive guards whose task was singular: to ensure that the physical purity of the chosen ones remained untainted for their sole rightful owner, the Sapa Inca. Life behind these walls was a perverse symbiosis of unimaginable luxury and absolute slavery. For 6 long years, Kilya lived under the supervision of the Mamakuna, elderly matrons who governed this closed world. They were her mentors and her jailers at the same time, and they taught her the most important thing: oblivion. She forgot how to run barefoot on the green slopes and feel the warm earth beneath her feet. She forgot the common dialect of her village. She was taught the refined and complex court language of Quechua. Her hands, which once gathered potatoes and beans, now learned the sacred art of weaving kumbi, the finest fabric in the empire, woven from vicuña wool. For hours, she created intricate geometric patterns called tokapu, each carrying a secret meaning, which only the emperor himself had the right to wear. But this education was not a gift, but a tool of taming. Her body was turned into a mechanism for performing rituals. She was taught hundreds of ceremonial poses and sacred hymns. But the main lesson she learned was the cruelest. Her body was no longer her own. It had become a sacred vessel, and a vessel, as is known, has and can have no will of its own. Inside the Aclahuasi, a rigid hierarchy reigned, which effectively divided the girls according to their future fate. At the very bottom of this pyramid were the Wairuru and Paco. These were the ones who, for some reason, did not meet the highest standards of divine beauty. Their lot was domestic chores, serving the more noble chosen ones, or the role of secondary concubines for imperial officials. By a cruel irony of fate, their physical imperfection became their salvation. It was highly likely they could live a long, albeit humiliating, life. But Kilya belonged to the very top, to the elite caste of the Yurak Akla, the white virgins of the sun. They were the most beautiful, the purest, and as a consequence, the most vulnerable. They lived in constant tension, knowing that at any moment they could be summoned to fulfill their highest duty. In this perverse world, perfect beauty was not a blessing, but a curse that inexorably brought them closer to the sacrificial altar with each passing day. Often on the cold and starless nights of Cusco, some new girl, not yet broken, would dare to whisper the forbidden word: escape. But the Mamakuna had an extremely effective method for extinguishing any sparks of disobedience. They did not use shackles or whips. They used real stories of horror, passed down from generation to generation as the most terrible warning. The most gruesome legend, one that sent a chill down the spine of even the bravest, was the story of Curie Koilur. The legend said that during the reign of Huayna Capac, the father of the famous Atahualpa, one of the maidens named Curie could no longer bear her confinement. One night, deceiving the vigilance of the eunuch guards, she fled towards the mountains, desperately dreaming of being in her mother's arms again. She was caught only 3 days later, exhausted, hungry, and trembling from the cold. But the punishment was not secret. The emperor ordered it to be made a public spectacle. The girl was brought to the capital's central square and forced to watch as a deep, narrow pit, resembling a well, was dug before her eyes. She was not beaten or burned at the stake. What they did was much worse. They placed her in the pit, and servants began to slowly cover her with earth. First, the earth covered her feet, robbing her of the ability to move. Then it reached her knees, then her waist. The pressure of the compacting soil began to crush her internal organs, turning every breath into an agony. The horror of Curricoiler's fate was not in a quick execution, but in a slow, conscious agony, in the sensation of the world swallowing her alive while she could still breathe and feel. When the earth reached her neck, they left her in that position. Her head, still alive, stuck out from the ground. She screamed and sobbed until her voice faded from suffocation, exhaustion, and immense terror. The chronicler Garcilaso de la Vega wrote that this was how she met her end, transformed into a grotesque monument to obedience, so that all the chosen maidens would know. In the eyes of the Inca, even the simple desire for freedom was punished with unimaginable cruelty. This image of Curie's head sticking out of the ground haunted Quilla in her nightmares. It was then that she finally understood that it was not only stone walls that held her captive. Her main jailer was a paralyzing, all-pervading fear. The certainty that her life was a grain of sand in the hands of a living God, who could dispose of it with a flick of his finger. Resistance meant sophisticated torture. An escape attempt meant certain death for her entire family. Losing her virginity to a common mortal meant being buried alive with him. Terror was the invisible mortar that held together the cyclopean stones of the Aclahuasi. And so Quilla learned to be silent. She learned to weave and to wait, knowing that her hour would inevitably come, and agonizingly wondering which of the 3 terrible doors of fate would open for her. For Quilla and her sisters in misfortune, the future was not a wide road with many paths, but a dead-end, narrow corridor that ended in 3 tightly locked doors. Each of them led to its own special kind of hell, meticulously designed by the politics and theology of the Inca Empire. The full horror of this system lay not so much in the physical cruelty itself as in its mundanity, in how human lives were reduced to the level of an administrative resource that could be written off as soon as the state deemed it expedient. The first door was the door of the political gift. This was, perhaps, the most common, but no less traumatic, fate. When the Sapa Inca wanted to reward a valiant general who had expanded the borders of Tawantinsuyu, or when he needed to strengthen the loyalty of a recalcitrant chief in a distant, recently conquered province, he sent them not gold or land. He sent them a woman. One of the Akla would be brought out of isolation, dressed in ceremonial garments, and sent on her way with an entourage, as if she were a precious goblet or a rare animal. Often, these young girls, barely of age, had to travel hundreds of kilometers along the imperial roads, crossing icy mountain passes and humid jungles, only to be handed over to a man they had never seen in their lives. A stranger who could be twice or even 3 times their age. In this scenario, the girl lost her quasi-divine status and was transformed into a living trophy, an object for pleasure and housekeeping. Her body, which had been so zealously guarded from any male gaze, became the property of a provincial lord, and her life would fade away in the slavery of a forced marriage, far from home and everything she had once known. For the empire, it was subtle diplomacy. For the girl, legalized and lifelong violence. But there were times when the empire required not diplomacy, but the desperate mercy of angered gods. When the earth trembled from earthquakes, when volcanoes spewed streams of fire and ash, or when the harshest droughts threatened to destroy the sacred maize crop, then the second door would open, the door of the Capacocha ritual. This was the most sacred and most gruesome sacrifice in the Inca state. It was not an act of spontaneous barbarism, but a ritual of terrifying, almost scientific sophistication. Spanish chroniclers, and most importantly, modern archaeology, have revealed its details to us with blood-curdling clarity. The most classic example is the Maiden of Lulailako. A forensic analysis of her long, braided hair, conducted by Dr. Andrew Wilson of the University of Bradford, made it possible to reconstruct the last months of her life with astonishing precision. The hair, like a biological flight recorder, had recorded all the chemical changes in her body. The data showed that about a year before her death, her diet changed drastically. Instead of the modest peasant fare of potatoes and vegetables, she began to receive llama meat and elite varieties of maize in abundance. She was being deliberately fattened up. The empire was investing in the quality of the sacrifice, so that she would be worthy to appear before the gods. But hair analysis revealed something more sinister. In the final weeks of her life, the concentration of alkaloids from coca leaves and alcohol byproducts from chicha, corn beer, spiked sharply in her system. This was not part of a celebration. It was a systematic medicinal preparation. The priests deliberately kept the girl in a state of constant stupor and mild euphoria, drugging her to make her docile and unable to fully comprehend the horror of what was happening. The procession to the sacred mountain was a funeral march painted in bright colors. Priests in lavish robes, nobles, and imperial guardsmen accompanied the victim, slowly ascending into the death zone to an altitude of over 6,000 meters, where the thin air turns every step into agony and the icy wind burns unprotected skin. Upon reaching the summit, she was not killed by a swift blow to the head, nor was her heart torn out, as the Aztecs practiced. The Incas preferred a cleaner, more aesthetic method. They would build a small burial chamber in advance, deep beneath the layer of permafrost. The girl, already in a semi-conscious state, was seated inside with her legs crossed, surrounded by miniature gold statuettes, exquisite ceramics, and provisions of food for her journey to the other world. She was given a final, massive dose of strong, fermented chicha mixed with ground coca leaves to drink. This was enough to make her lose consciousness, but she remained alive. And then workers would place the final heavy stone slab, sealing the tomb forever. Try to imagine this moment for an instant. The absolute silence of the high-altitude desert, impenetrable darkness, and the cold, slowly, millimeter by millimeter, seeping through the thin layers of ceremonial clothing. The internal organs of the Maiden of Lulailako were so perfectly preserved that scientists were able to confidently determine the cause of death, hypothermia and gradual asphyxiation. Her heart continued to beat in the darkness, pumping the thickening blood ever more slowly, until her mind, clouded by a narcotic haze, finally dissolved into an eternal sleep. She was simply left to freeze, all alone, like a flawless gift wrapped in ice for an indifferent mountain deity. And yet, there was a fate feared even more than the ritual on the icy summit. The third door opened only when the sun set forever, on the day of the Sapa Inca's own death. Tradition demanded that the god-emperor not depart for the other world alone. He needed his retinue, his treasures, and most importantly, his women. When Emperor Huayna Capac died in 1527, a victim of the smallpox epidemic that reached the Andes before the conquistadors themselves, the final, most terrible hour arrived for the chosen maidens of his personal harem. Pedro Pizarro, nephew of the conqueror of Peru and an eyewitness to the final days of the empire, described with a shudder how this mass funerary accompaniment took place. This was not a matter of a few volunteers. The chronicles claim that thousands of people, including servants, officials, and favorite concubines, were put to death to accompany the great rulers. In the case of the highest-ranking Akala, those who had the honor of sharing the Inca's bed, their fate was sealed without any hope. They were dressed in the most luxurious garments, given drink to the point of complete intoxication at farewell ceremonies where they were expected to sing and dance, knowing that death was already breathing down their necks. Unlike the drugged children for the Capacocha, these were adult women who understood perfectly well what awaited them. Perhaps some of them, driven to fanaticism by years of ideological indoctrination, accepted their fate with stoic submission, sincerely believing in the promise of eternal service to their master in the afterlife. But many, very many, did not want to die. The guards had to drag them by force, and their families were threatened with retribution in case of disobedience. The methods varied, but being buried alive was considered the most prestigious and simultaneously the most cruel. They were led into huge, pre-prepared burial chambers or royal tombs. They were seated in a circle around the mummified body of the emperor, and then the stonemasons would begin to seal the entrance, stone by stone. The sliver of daylight grew thinner and finally disappeared completely. Unlike death from hypothermia on a mountain, which gradually lulls all senses, death in a sealed tomb is a nightmare of conscious, claustrophobic despair. As oxygen ran out and carbon dioxide built up in the enclosed space, panic inevitably seized the victims. During the excavation of some royal tombs, archaeologists found the skeletons of women in poses that completely refute the official version of a peaceful and voluntary passing. Some of them were not sitting in meditative poses, but were contorted against the walls, with deformed and broken finger bones, a silent testament to the fact that in their final moments of life, they had desperately tried to scratch their way out through the stone. They screamed in the absolute darkness as long as their air lasted. They suffocated next to the embalmed body of their master, turned into eternal funerary artifacts, denied the right to live even after their lord was already dead. Such was the ultimate reality of the Aklawasi, the complete, absolute annihilation of human personality in the name of power. Quilla, looking out her window in 1532, knew this, and she knew that any of those three doors could swing open for her at any moment. In 1532, the sky over the Andes darkened, not from the wrath of the god Inti, but from the smoke of a war that no priest had foretold. The arrival of Francisco Pizarro and his handful of foreign adventurers in the sacred city of Cusco marked the end of an entire era. But for the hundreds of women locked in the Aklawasi, it meant something far more concrete and tangible, a sudden breakdown in the mechanism that had been created to destroy them. The fall of the Inca Empire was an event of cataclysmic proportions. The theocratic structure, which had seemed as unshakable as the mountains themselves, crumbled to dust with astonishing speed under the onslaught of Toledan steel, cavalry, and an invisible killer, smallpox. Inside the House of the Chosen, the centuries-old, unshakable order dissolved into primordial chaos. The priests of the sun, who only yesterday had walked with the arrogance of men possessing absolute truth, fled in panic or were slaughtered on the steps of their own temples. The Mamakuna, the stern guardians of keys and traditions, abandoned their posts, leaving the gates open and the precious textiles on the looms unfinished. For the first time in a century, the dead liturgical silence of the Aklawasi's corridors was shattered by the sounds of the real world, screams, the clash of weapons, and the roar of a city gripped by panic. For historians, the conquest of Peru is a tragedy of blood, fire, and the destruction of a great culture. But history always has more than one face, and for Quilla, this Incan apocalypse had a strange, forbidden taste. the taste of hope. From her window, she saw how gods who demanded human blood were being thrown from their golden pedestals by bearded newcomers who feared neither the wrath of the sun nor the curses of the priests. The invincibility of the Sapa Inca turned out to be a myth, and if the Inca was not a god, then she was not a sacred sacrifice, but merely a prisoner in a luxurious stone prison. The decision that Kilya made in the midst of this bloody whirlwind was not heroic in the usual sense of the word, but it was an act of radical, desperate survival. While her world burned, she and dozens of other chosen virgins did the unthinkable. They simply walked towards the exit. No divine lightning struck them as they crossed the sacred threshold. No eunuch guards blocked their path. All around was only dust, noise, screams, and the complete chaos of a world changing its master before their very eyes. Kilya took her first step outside the Acalahuasi after 6 years of confinement. The street air smelled of gunpowder, horse sweat, and fear, not of incense and withering flowers, and for her, it was the smell of life. The chronicler Pedro Chiesa de Leon recorded with unconcealed astonishment a phenomenon that modern history textbooks prefer to ignore. He wrote that when the Spanish entered Cusco, many of these virgins of the sun did not flee from the conquistadors, but on the contrary, ran to them. They purposefully sought refuge in the invaders' camps. It is an inconvenient but irrefutable truth. For many of these women, the Spanish invasion, in its initial stage, was seen not as a new slavery, but as liberation from the religious terror of their own state. They preferred the uncertainty and potential cruelty of the coarse foreigners to the mathematical certainty of being sacrificed or walled up alive by their own rulers. Kilya found herself alone in a city she no longer recognized. Her home village was weeks away, in a province ravaged by the civil war between the heir brothers to the throne and devastated by epidemics. She had no home to return to, for to her people she had long been dead, given to the gods many years ago. So she did the only thing she could to avoid starving to death. She became a servant to a Spanish encomendero, a landowner granted the right by the crown to exploit the local population. She transformed from a living, untouchable goddess into an anonymous servant who washed floors and cooked for coarse soldiers. It was a cruel exchange. She lost her high status, her fine clothes, and the reverence that had surrounded her. But in return, she received something the Inca Empire would never have given her: the chance to grow old. She no longer had to flinch at every step of the priests, fearing they were measuring her for a stone sarcophagus. She no longer had to look with terror at the mountain peaks, wondering if she would be chosen for the next sacrifice. The merciless machine of ritual death had stopped. The Acalahuasi system collapsed not only under the blows of Spanish weapons, it also collapsed because its victims, at the very moment the cage doors opened, chose any other fate rather than remain pawns on a divine chessboard. Kilya survived the end of her world, and in this quiet, unnoticed survival, she achieved her personal victory over a system that was designed to erase her from existence. Quilla's freedom, won at such a terrible price, proved to be short-lived and was marked by the harshness of the new, transitional world. In 1547, at the age of 29, her lungs finally failed, but not from a lack of air in a sealed tomb beneath an icy peak, but from tuberculosis, an invisible plague that had crossed the ocean on the ships of the conquistadors. She was buried in an ordinary colonial cemetery in Lima, in a common, unmarked grave, wrapped in a piece of coarse cotton cloth. There were no priests chanting sacred hymns, no vessels of ceremonial chicha, no golden statuettes to accompany her into the other world. For official history, her life was utterly insignificant, just another number in the statistics of the 16th century demographic catastrophe. And yet, in this anonymous darkness lay her main, personal victory. Quilla departed this life as an ordinary person, suffering, fearing, and fighting for her own existence until her last breath, not as a passive symbol voluntarily sacrificed to eternity. She left on her own terms, a victim of disease, but not of a tyrant's will. 500 years later, modern science brought her sisters to light, those who lacked the luck, time, or courage to escape. The maiden of Lulailico and other children sacrificed on Andean peaks now gaze at us from airtight glass cases in high-tech museums. Their serene faces, perfect skin, and vibrant clothing attract millions of tourists and become subjects for fascinating documentaries. We admire their almost supernatural preservation, the complexity of the fabrics they are clothed in, and the incredible logistics that allowed the Incas to deliver them to the very clouds. But in admiring the aesthetic beauty of these mummies, we run a serious risk of romanticizing their tragedy. These perfectly preserved bodies are not mystical ambassadors of ancient wisdom. They are tangible, forensic evidence of state crimes. This is irrefutable proof of the existence of a totalitarian system that believed it possessed the divine right to dispose of children's lives just as it disposed of clay or corn. Our fascination with the gold and mysteries of the Incas often blinds us, preventing us from seeing the fundamental cruelty upon which their theocracy was built. The true legacy of the Akalawasi lies not in the golden trinkets with which they were adorned, but in the deafening silence they left behind. The monumental history of great empires is almost always built on the bones of the most defenseless, and we too rarely pause to try to hear their voices. By excavating these girls today, we are not just bringing an archaeological past back from oblivion. We are bringing to light an eternal warning about the nature of absolute power. The greatness of a civilization should be measured not only by the height of its pyramids, the precision of its calendars, or the length of its roads, but also by how it treated those who had no voice to stand up for themselves. Quilla was forgotten by chroniclers and erased from the knotted records of the Quipu. But her choice to live, however briefly and in poverty, is the only act of defiance that time could not mummify. The snow-capped peaks of the Andes today seem to slumber in eternal peace, casting a majestic shadow on a world that has changed beyond recognition. But there, beneath the thick ice and in the foundations of the ruins we visit as tourists, the echo of the voices of girls like Quilla still waits to be heard. We tell this story not to judge an ancient culture by the standards of modern morality. We do it to remind you of one universal and very dangerous truth. Absolute power, whatever its form, will always seek beautiful, sometimes even divine masks to justify the most extreme cruelty. When we forget the crimes committed in the name of gods or the state, we allow history to repeat itself. We allow new systems of violence to hide under the plausible mask of tradition, necessity, or a higher purpose. If this story has moved you, if you have felt the chill of the stone cell or the agony of the impossible choice between ritual death and slavery, I ask you not to let silence win again. Share this video so that the voices of the chosen virgins, silenced for centuries by earth and oblivion, may finally find an echo in our collective memory. Give it a like if you believe that historical truth, however painful it may be, deserves to be brought to light. What do you think? Is there a clear line between religious fanaticism and an organized state crime? Or is it simply a matter of who ultimately writes history? Leave your opinion in the comments, as open discussion is the only way to keep our historical conscience alive. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell, because there are still many nameless graves and dark pages of the past ahead that we must explore together. Until the next story that time tried to bury.